Good evening and welcome to the History at Night program at San Felipe de Austin State Historic Site, sponsored by the Friends of San Felipe de Austin State Historic Site, a great benefactor of ours. Tonight's program is a little different. This is the ninth of our 10 sessions this year, our second season of History at Night, a season that's been entirely virtual because of the pandemic. So one of the great opportunities of doing distance-based programming is getting a chance to bring speakers from places who couldn't otherwise join us physically. And tonight is a great example of that. Dr. Sean Kelly from the University of Essex is going to be presenting tonight's program and has been able to do that virtually for us, but it does create some changes in our typical format. So he and I are not going to interact live as any part of this program tonight. We've been exchanging communication via email and talking to each other about how this program could be presented to you. At the end, we will have a chance for you to do some questions or send some questions to us if you'd like. So if you're motivated by something you see tonight, send me an email. You'll get that information at the end of the program. And we're going to interact with Dr. Kelly about a follow-up that will include some of the questions that were motivated by this evening's session. So real quickly, Dr. Sean Kelly, who again teaches at the University of Essex, is an historian and scholar of New World slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. His book, Los Brazos de Dios, examined a major plantation region in Texas, the lower Brazos River Valley, during Austin's colony. And I read the book about a decade ago when it first came out and was recently motivated by an excellent program Dr. Kelly did for Rice University that I got a chance to see. And I was reminded to go back and read the book again, and he's been very generous to work with us when I invited him to do our May program. Dr. Kelly has also published a microhistory of a single slave trading voyage from 1754 in his second book, and is at work on a third book as we speak that examines the involvement of North American merchants in the slave trade between 1644 and 1865. Dr. Kelly's been involved with the Freedom Narratives Project, a collaborative effort by scholars on 4 continents to collect, transcribe, and publish autobiographical testimonies of Africans from the era of the slave trade. He's also the UK principal investigator for the Documenting Africans in Transatlantic Slavery, or DATAS project. This project also reflects a 4-continent collaboration among scholars working to build a biographical database of enslaved peoples. Dr. Kelly received his BA from San Francisco State University and both an MA and PhD from the University of Texas at Austin. He's previously taught at institutions in the United States before taking his current post at the University of Essex in 2015. So tonight's program, he's going to walk you through some of his research related to this slave economy that developed in the lower Brazos River Valley. And you'll hear him speaking over some of his PowerPoint and slide support. At the end of this session, like I said, I'll come back to you and give you information on how to submit questions to us. We certainly hope you enjoy the History at Night program for the month of May, and that you look forward to coming for future programming as well. I'm happy to announce that this fall, we intend to resume in-person History at Night programming here at the site, and are also looking for ways to continue some of this compelling virtual programs, particularly things that can explore speakers like Dr. Kelly, who otherwise would not have been able to join us. We're particularly grateful that Dr. Kelly made time for us in the month of May, which is a terrible time for college professors in the scheme of things, finishing up a term, and also with him in the middle of trying to finalize this third book. So it was very generous of him to work with us. We hope you enjoy tonight's program.
All right, welcome everybody to today's presentation. My name is Sean Kelly, and I'm a professor of history at the University of Essex, which is in the UK. I very much regret that I can't be there in person to deliver this talk. I would have enjoyed that very, very much. Hope if you do have questions, I think we're going to figure out a way for me to answer them. But just want to say sorry. Wish I could be there, but obviously I think you all know the circumstances here with the global pandemic we're still working through. I'll just say a couple of words about myself before getting into this. I am actually, as you can hear from my accent, I'm not British, I'm American. And in fact, this you also probably can't hear in my accent, but I'm actually a native Texan. I actually was born in Texas while my father was stationed there, and so I am indeed a native Texan. We left before I was 2, so I didn't grow up there, but I did return for graduate school when I was in my 20s, and wound up writing my PhD dissertation on Texas history, which I had never really anticipated I would do, and of course writing a book out of that. So I have actually a lot of memories of the Brazos. That's not where I was born. I was born farther east in Texas, but oddly enough, my family wound up when I was about 10 years old. Wound up going on vacation in Freeport, Texas. So that was I guess, my first real experience with the Brazos. Anyway, that's all pretty silly trivia. I'm going to be talking to you today mostly about the history of the Lower Brazos. The 5 counties that I've looked at in the research that I've done are Brazoria, Fort Bend, Austin, Washington, and Grimes, so what I call the Lower Brazos. And a lot of what I say really can be applied not just to the Brazos, but of course to the neighboring counties over on the Colorado River, which have a very similar history. It's not identical. Every place is slightly unique, but a lot of what I say can really be applied to those as well. And of course, some of what I say here too can be applied to all of Texas. Although the Brazos is a particularly it's slightly unique in Texas history as the real hearth of Texas slavery. And if there's any one region of Texas that you could point to and just say, this is a place where slavery was extremely important, it would be the Lower Brazos. It kind of stands out as a region. It's the oldest plantation slavery region in Texas, and it was also the richest and most important. So a lot of what I say today is really going to revolve around slavery and its history and significance for this region during the 19th century. You're looking here at a picture from about 1830 of the John McNeill place, who was, of course, as I'm sure many of you probably realize, was one of the early Anglo settlers in what's now Brazoria County. And I also have here just a picture of myself in case you were wondering what I look like. Not much, but there it is. All right, I want to start by placing Brazos slavery and plantation society in a much wider historical perspective. And I think one way to do this is to, when you think about the trajectory of slavery in the Americas, because remember, slavery was not something that was limited simply to the U.S. South or the United States, period. It was an institution that flourished throughout the Western Hemisphere. And I always say to students, you find slavery everywhere from what's now Canada down to Tierra del Fuego. I mean, it was everywhere. It doesn't mean it was equally significant or in all of those places. Obviously, there were some places where slavery was very, very important and other places where it was much less so. But remember, it covered, legally speaking, everywhere. For a long time. And sometimes historians talk about this era of slavery, roughly maybe from about 1500 to 1800, as the first slavery. That may oversimplify things a bit, but I think it gets to a kind of a point here. And if you were to pull out some of the basic characteristics of this first slavery before 1800, you'd probably highlight the fact that it was driven by a kind of a new rising European consumer society that had, enough income to enjoy luxury products, right? And that's what most of the things that were produced in the Americas ultimately were. That this first slavery operated mostly within the framework of the, sort of mercantilist empires. So in the British world, you had British colonies like Virginia or Jamaica, growing products that were, for the most part, exported back to Britain. and so forth. And the slave trade that supplied the labor was usually carried out, by British ships and slave traders and so on. And the same could be said then for the French Empire. Everybody's operating within that paradigm, Spanish Empire, Portuguese Empire, and so on. You could also say of this first slavery that the real sort of key crop for this first slavery was sugar. But of course, more so if you're thinking about North America, you're thinking about tobacco in Virginia as really the main products. And these are, again, for a relatively small, affluent, rising middle class kind of market. And this is a picture here of women hoeing, enslaved women hoeing in a tobacco field in Virginia, which is kind of characteristic of this first slavery. Second slavery, historians, would argue actually differed quite in a lot of ways from this first slavery. It was driven mostly by industrialization in Europe, because as a lot of you, I'm sure already realize, Europe, starting in Britain, began to industrialize in the second half of the 18th century, and it really picked up through the 19th century. And slavery in the Americas was then driven by this. And the way that some social scientists have framed this has been to say that as industrialization took place in what were called the core areas, thinking of Europe and the United States, it led to the growth of slavery in what are called sort of the peripheral areas. So you wind up with a world system where you have this sort of industrial core characterized by manufacturing, wage labor, and so on, growing affluence, but that exists in a kind of relationship with the periphery, which is much of the rest of the world, where the raw materials are grown and exported to these core areas. And so that's characteristic of the second slavery, this sort of industry driving that kind of growth. Unlike the old first slavery that operated or existed within mostly a mercantilist imperial framework, second slavery was really situated in a growing, an increasingly sort of free trade world system. This took some time. It wasn't something that happened immediately. But over the course of the 19th century, trade barriers just tended to fall. And that allowed for this sort of circulation of all this slave-grown produce to a lot of other places. So you're not just exporting back to the mother country anymore. Another difference here with second slavery is the crop. It's, of course, in the United States, we're talking here about cotton. Cotton had not been a major crop really before 1800. The Whitney gin was patented 1793. And cotton really spread across the lower South during the first part of the 19th century. So the Texas story is obviously going to be very much that. And of course, cotton is really important because it's the thing that fuels the textile mills back in places like Britain or in New England, where they had the industries. So once again, it kind of draws our attention to that relationship. There's a direct relationship between sort of industry in these core areas and slavery out on the periphery, producing things like that. But cotton wasn't the only thing that was grown here during the second slavery. Sugar continued to be grown. Coffee became a very, very important crop in Brazil. And of course, tobacco continued to be grown. And one thing that historians have pointed out, and again, gets back to this connection here between slavery and industrialization, is that these are all, sometimes people almost refer to them as drug crops. These are all, in one way, sugar, coffee, tobacco, are stimulants. And what that really speaks to is the fact that back in these industrial areas, you now have an enormous industrial labor force that's exploited, it's poor, and it's existing, it's able to kind of continue to stay at the machines because they're all hyped up on sugar, which is very, very cheap calories, poor nutrition, but lots of calories. Coffee, with an obvious stimulant, and tobacco. These become objects of mass consumption, which again is going to drive slavery. So when we think about Texas, Obviously, it fits the bill here as the kind of place that would be on the periphery, growing at least some of these crops, to especially cotton, to keep that industrial system going. So I want to talk a little bit about the development of Brazos slavery. Of course, one of the things I always say about the Brazos, you could say this about Texas in general, is it was actually the only slave society to develop in a Latin American republic. People forget that. It's a point that's easy to overlook. But this actually led to some anomalies that I'll explore a little bit later. But of course, slavery was, again, not, existed throughout the hemisphere, and it did exist in Mexico before annexation by the United States, before Anglo settlement. Actually, slavery peaked in colonial Mexico between the years 1580 to 1640, when the Spanish, as a result of the demographic collapse of the indigenous population, had been looking to replace indigenous laborers with enslaved African laborers. So there's this period here in the 16th and 17th centuries where a lot of Africans are coming into Mexico, but the indigenous population recovered, and by and large Spain relied mostly on Indian labor to run its colony in Mexico. So slavery then began to decline after 1640. It didn't disappear until the early 19th century. There were pockets and places where there were small numbers of enslaved people, but for the most part, by the 19th century, the once large enslaved African population of Mexico had almost become invisible. It become kind of absorbed within the sort of the larger mestizaje of Mexican history, to the point where actually in Mexico today it's a little bit of a problem that there's probably not enough recognition of the importance of African slavery. Anyway, so that in Texas, of course, the enslaved population during the Spanish and Mexican periods were nearly negligible. And Texas, as I think you all know, was very, very sparsely populated in the Spanish era. And of course, slavery then really took root in Texas and in the Brazos with Anglo colonization, which began with the Austin colony in 1821. And famously, a lot of you probably know the story of Jared Gross, the first planter in Texas, who marched at the head of a column of 100 slaves into Texas from the United States, and set up a plantation, Bernardo Plantation, which is in modern-day Waller County. It's near Hempstead. I'm sure many of you know it better than I do. And I've always found this to be kind of an incident that, I don't know, it's thought-provoking, because Gross, here he is at the, leading nearly 100 people into Texas, and you're wondering, what allowed that to happen? Why did that work? But it did, and that became the the kind of in some ways the beginning of Texas Plantation Society. By the way, there's a lot more to the Jared Gross story than I think a lot of people realize. I've since writing the book and doing all that research years ago, I've come across information that suggests that probably a lot of the people who marched with him into Texas were African born, and probably had only recently been illegally imported by way of Florida. But anyway, that's another story. So as it developed on the Brazos, and this is, by the way, sorry, I'm behind my pictures here. This is a picture of enslaved man being beaten during the Spanish period. But slavery, as it developed on the Brazos, developed slightly differently in different regions, and you see this sometimes in the old literature, the old documents and the like, referred to as the distinction between what they call the lower country, which would really be modern day Brazoria and Fort Bend, and the upper country, which would be Austin, which of course would include Waller historically, Washington County, and Grimes counties. The lower country, Brazoria and Fort Bend, as I think probably everybody realizes, is fairly flat, and it's cut by, of course, the Brazos River. But when you get down into Brazoria County, of the San Bernard River and Oyster Creek and other places, and so it's a very low-lying delta, essentially, and so it was extremely fertile soil. It was good. The river transportation was good all year round. You could always take a steamboat up the Brazos. It might be a long way because it's a twisty river, but you could reach these areas. And so this lower country developed both because of the fertility of being in a delta, and also the water transportation developed very, very quickly. So right away in the 1820s, and certainly even more so during the 1830s, you start to see plantations developing here, especially in Brazoria County. And these would eventually become very, very large plantations. I mean, you're looking here, the picture on the screen is, I'm sure a lot of you recognize, the Varner Hogg Plantation, which had been known as the Patton Place. Became a sugar plantation, which we'll talk about in a moment. But these were large plantations, and you could have plantations in the lower country. I mean, the biggest would have over 100 people on them. There are a handful in the 200 and up range, but these are large, very, very large. Most of these plantations, of course, were cotton plantations because, again, that is simply the major, crop in Texas. But the lower country is actually kind of unique in the sense that it developed a few sugar plantations, a couple of dozen actually. The Varner Hogg, or the Patton Place, was just one of those. But Perry's Peach Point became a sugar plantation, and the McNeils ran the biggest plantations, sugar plantations. Ellerslie, down also in Brazoria County, was a massive plantation that produced sugar, and sometimes at the same time they might do cotton. The real sugar, by the way, really came along only kind of toward the latter part. Almost all these plantations began as cotton plantations and then converted, if they ever did convert to sugar, they would do that really probably in the late 1840s or the 1850s. So that's kind of a late development. But here, with all these big plantations, you inevitably had an enslaved majority. I'll show you the numbers, but we're talking in Brazoria County of about 75%. So 3 out of 4 Brazoria County residents would have been enslaved during this era. I have numbers in the next slide that I'll let you see. The upper country unfolded, the upper country also was a place, here again, we're talking about Austin, Waller, Washington, Grimes, was also a place where slavery was extremely important. It's just the scale was not the same as in the lower country. We're looking here at this is a picture of one of the Washington County plantations. Washington County became a very, very important cotton planting area. This is the William Browning plantation house. And the pattern that developed in the upper country was for the river bottom areas and places. One of the ones I studied very carefully was Chapel Hill, Texas, and Washington County. It developed very large river bottom cotton plantations, and so these could be, they weren't, for the most part, they weren't quite as big as the plantations down in the lower country, but they were still very sizable, 50, 80, that's, that kind of range. Enslaved people is what I mean there. But there were also a lot of smaller plantations, and just farms. There were of course non-slave holding planters, and these tended to be sort of outside of the river bottom areas, in either direction, east or west of the Brazos. Close to half of the population was enslaved. Again, I have a slide in a moment with the numbers, but actually in a few of these counties, like Washington County, Washington County was actually over 50%. So most of the population there was enslaved. And the really curious thing about the upper country, and this really intrigued me a lot when I was doing this work, is there was also a sizable minority of German immigrants. And this is a kind of an unusual thing, because most European immigrants avoided the plantation areas. They tended to move into the north, into cities, or into areas of free labor where they could just sort of work with farms. They didn't like the idea of competing with enslaved labor. But the upper country, and especially Austin County, on the western side, sort of the Belleville area, Cat Spring industry, attracted a lot of German immigrants. And I think this really happened. It was, in some sense, it's a matter of timing, that the Germans moved in. You really start to see the German settlement in the 1830s. Before this particular area, the upcountry had really developed as a major plantation area. Remember, I said the real sort of beginnings were in the lower country. So the Germans, when they came to Austin County, weren't really coming to a major plantation area yet, but that would eventually kind of develop around them. We'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. Just quickly, I won't dwell on this slide, but in case you're kind of curious about the numbers, I draw your attention here to these are the population in 1860. And you can see Brazoria is really about 75% of the population was enslaved. Washington County, as I said, 52%. Grimes is 53%. And so for the region as a whole, the percentage is 54.6%. So most people are enslaved. All right. Well, one of the interesting things about the Brazos, again, as a result of the fact, if you think about it as existing within a larger global framework for slavery, a couple of things actually stand out in relation to that, and you begin to see, and these are actually some of the interesting and in some cases unique features of Brazos slavery. The first is that the Brazos and the lower Brazos, and here especially I'm talking about Brazoria County, was actually almost unique in American history as being a place with a large population of illegally imported African-born enslaved people. And this came about as as the result of several circumstances. So let me kind of work through that here. By the way, you're looking here at a picture of one of them. His name was Washington Edwards. Sorry, it's a bit faded there, but he was born in Africa, and he was one of maybe up to 1,000 or so Africans who were brought illegally into Texas. So of course, by the 19th century, during this second slavery, the transatlantic slave trade that had been a major part of the first slavery was illegal, and it was fully illegal globally, really, after about 1830. And so that didn't mean that it didn't go on, though. And so one of the other interesting things about the second slavery I mentioned is during the 19th century, although the slave trade was illegal for the most part, it continued actually at a very high level. Not into the United States, though. So the United States didn't really rely on the transatlantic slave trade in the 19th century. The enslaved population in the United States was able to kind of, reproduce itself. And that's where, most of the growth came from. But in Brazil and Cuba, there was a continued reliance on the transatlantic slave trade. Texas planters became involved in the transatlantic slave trade during the 1830s because, on the one hand, they've got all this land in Texas that they're hoping to develop into plantations, but in order to do that, they need labor. And I've always thought that probably one of the reasons why they turned to the illegal slave trade was because a lot of them were, in a sense, kind of priced out of the market in the United States. They had moved into Texas. A lot of them did it because they were fleeing debts, so they had bad credit. The fact that debts weren't collectible in Texas from the United States meant that people were kind of reluctant to lend them money. And then finally, of course, the fact that, as the conflict between Texas and Mexico heated up, ultimately resulting in independence, that led to a lot of kind of, confused authority the legal authority became a little bit shaky, and that created an opportunity for these smugglers. And so what they did mostly is they went to Cuba. So Texans were going into Cuba and purchasing newly arrived African-born slaves, and they transported them to the Brazos. And most of them wound up in Brazoria County. I've done a lot of, I'm very, very interested in this question, so I did some research on this, and it seems very likely, I feel pretty confident, that probably most of the Africans who lived in Texas were actually of Yoruba background, and that was a group that had sort of become enslaved in large numbers in the early 1830s and wound up in Cuba, and therefore when the Texans went down to Cuba, they were bringing in people who had recently arrived from Africa and were of Yoruba background. So as I said, in Brazoria County, maybe about 1,000 enslaved African-born people were brought in during the 1830s. And this gave Brazoria County kind of a unique quality. Now, it wouldn't take too long before the Africans would be outnumbered by American-born slaves. That probably happened fairly quickly. But the African presence would continue, and it's kind of interesting. I mean, if you study the slavery in Brazoria carefully, you see them popping up all over the place. They pop up in plantation records, and Africans pop up in runaway slave ads, and they, of course, continued into the post-emancipation period. Some of them lived a very long time, like Washington Edwards. So it gave Brazoria kind of a very unique thing, and this is as a result of kind of the confluence of circumstances here, Texas slavery. The other really interesting, you could think of it as an anomaly in terms of the history of American slavery, is the presence of lots of German immigrants. As I mentioned a moment ago, most of them were concentrated in the upper country, especially in Austin County. And they came also as a result of changes to the global economy. So this is sort of another example of the sort of global connections shaping the Brazos. In this case, most of them left Germany as a result of a disruption to German rural life. Free trade undermined old cottage industries, and industrialization undermined a lot of that, and a lot of Germans responded to these changes when life became not viable where many of them lived. They responded by migrating, and they migrated sometimes within Germany, sometimes within Europe, but of course also by the millions to the Americas, not just to North America, but also to South America and Central America. Germans were everywhere. And they did this, they accomplished this through, by organizing their own immigration networks. This is the phenomenon known as chain migration. And it simply means when you have an original immigrant, a person like, if we're looking here at Charles Fortran, a lot of you probably know the name, from industry in Austin County, that what tends to happen is they, once they kind of set themselves up and things are going well, they write home and they tell people, well, here's how it's gone for me, and that word spreads through families, and they migrate to, usually the classic thing would be then to, go look up Fortran when you get to the New World, and that's how these clusters of immigrants evolve, right? So immigration is almost always structured. It's never random. You never get like a random scattering of free immigrants, because they work through these networks, and that leads to clusters like in Austin County, like you get industry and Cat Spring and so on, these little German enclaves, and that's the result of chain migration. The Germans, of course, were interesting. They were. There's been a lot of debate over their attitude towards slavery, because slavery, of course, existed in Texas as they migrated, and it really grew at the same time. And it's a very, very complicated question, and I don't really explore all of the facets right here, but I will say that it's a bit of a mixed picture. I'm fairly convinced that there were probably an awful lot of Germans who were suspicious of slavery, but there were also plenty of Germans who either didn't have a problem with it, and a few who became slaveholders, like Fortran. And it's a mixed picture. There's always been kind of a lot of question about that. I'm going to come back to this in just a moment, but I want to say something too about, again, the sort of the global position of Texas and the Brazos. And the other feature here is the emergence of the U.S.-Mexico border. Of course, Texas seceded from Mexico in 1836 and was annexed by the United States in 1845, and that implied the drawing of a border between Texas and Mexico at the Rio Grande. And what's interesting here is that, if you think about the U.S. and Mexico, what you have here are two republics. These are two former European colonies that, within the space of, about 50 years, like almost all of the New World colonies, they declared independence from their former, colonial motherland. And part of this process of this sort of these republics becoming independent was, in most cases, a kind of a questioning of slavery. And that did happen in the United States. There was, during the American Revolution, a kind of a throwing open this question of slavery. And there was a lot of debate over whether slavery was good for the American Republic or not. I think a lot of you know that the final answer to that was that Americans kept slavery, but Mexicans didn't. In that sense, we're maybe a little bit truer to the kind of, Republican revolutionary heritage. So Mexico, more or less made slavery illegal. It's a slightly confused question, but there's really shouldn't be any doubt that the point of Mexico, the intent of Mexico, was to make slavery illegal. What that meant, of course, is as slavery was growing on in Texas, it was, Mexico was a place of non-slavery, a place of freedom, and the Rio Grande became the symbol of this, boundary between slavery and freedom. That, of course, led to massive flight of enslaved people from Texas plantations down into Mexico. It's surely over the antebellum period, the numbers are probably in the thousands. And it was something that Texas planters were very, very aware of. They tried to patrol. They sent expeditions into Mexico to recover people who had run away. And it was very much kind of a feature of Brazos slavery. And again, we're drawn to these global connections once more. Here, by the way, is a map from 1850 or so, showing vividly there's that boundary between Texas and Mexico, between slavery and freedom. So Texas slavery, like all of American slavery, was based on the notion of racial difference, racial inferiority, right? On the idea that Africans were in some essential way different and lesser than whites. And that, of course, furnished a justification for maintaining slavery. Again, there's a vast literature on this, and sometimes historians refer to a chicken and egg question about whether racial attitudes stimulated the growth of slavery, or whether slavery informed and set off ideas about race. I don't want to wade into that too deeply at the moment, but I think certainly by the 19th century we could say that these were very mutually reinforcing. In other words, slavery in the United States and in Texas was limited to Black people of African descent. And in Texas, especially to a much greater degree than elsewhere in the United States, freedom was associated with being white. And this is to say there were very, very few free Blacks on the Brazos or in Texas. That's not the case elsewhere, by the way. If we were, you could look at examples in the U.S. like Maryland, which had slavery. Maryland was, of course, a slave state, but it also had a large free black population. You can look at other places in the Americas, in Cuba and Brazil, where you have slavery, but you also have a lot of free blacks. That just was not the case in Texas. There were a lot of legal restrictions on free blacks. It made them very, very rare. So Texas is a place, and the lower Brazos is very definitely a place where slavery and race are very, very tightly aligned, right? Black means enslaved, white means free. And even on the Brazos, as everywhere in the United States, this kind of racial pseudoscience began to grow up through the 19th century in order to reinforce slavery. And there was actually a figure, a person, some of you may know, on the Brazos who was very much, a participant in this sort of pseudoscientific elaboration of race. His name was Gideon Luncecum, and he had, immigrated. He was born in Georgia, but he migrated to Texas, like a lot of people did. He was a slaveholder, settled in Washington County. And he was kind of a scientifically minded. He was sort of like, think of him as like a naturalist or an amateur scientist. He liked to make scientific observations, and he read scientific literature, and he corresponded with people like Darwin. And he was also believed in, racial science. And here's a quote from him, which, here, I'll read the quote. It says, "The only condition in which the African species of our genus can be elevated above the animal development, which naturally preponderates his cerebral organization, is slavery." I mean, this is his justification for slavery. And I would just point out the scientific language he's using about an African species. Of course, humans are all the same species, and they're all the same genus. Race does not exist in biologically. I think the scientists will tell you that there is no connection between genetics and race. Race is created socially. And the interesting thing is that in Texas, you can see at moments, as again, for the most part, race and slavery coincide very, very tightly, but there are these moments where you can see, it's like pulling back the curtain on The Wizard of Oz, and you can see them not really coming together. And one of these was a fascinating court case that took place in 1856, came before the Texas Supreme Court. It's called Gaines versus Ann. And it didn't take place on the Brazos, but one of the lawyers who was involved in the case did live on the Brazos. His name was Will Neblett. He's the husband of Lizzie Neblett. Some of you may know, Grimes County, a woman who left a wonderfully rich diary. But Neblett was involved in this case. So there's my Brazos connection. But it's a fascinating case. Anne was an enslaved woman who looked white because she had one black grandmother, and she sued for her freedom on the basis that she was white, and Texas law confined slavery to the African race. So she's basically saying, you can't even see that I'm 1/8 black, and therefore I deserve my freedom. So she won her initial freedom suit, but she lost in the Texas Supreme Court. And what's really interesting about this case is that the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Abner Lipscomb, who was a very famous originally a lawyer from Alabama, had wrote a decision in which he was very, very troubled by this. On the one hand, he says, you do not get to be free. He says, no, because first off, being 1/8, that's still black, even if it's not really visible. But more importantly, because slave status descends through the mother's line. So if your mother was enslaved, then you are enslaved, right? That slave status descends that way. And because there's no question that, it was Anne's grandmother who had been black and enslaved, and then therefore Anne's mother, and then Anne herself, in Lipscomb's mind, there was no question. She's Anne's going to have to remain in slavery. But the whole thing, the idea of, sending back a woman who looks white into slavery really troubled Lipscomb, and he said it caused him grave reflections, because what he realized is that if Anne were to have children, her children would actually be, in a sense, legally white. They would be allowed to testify against whites in court. And then you've reached a point where you're holding people who are arguably white in slavery. And I think this is very, very interesting, because what it shows you is the artificial, we tend to think of race as this very natural thing, and it's in the Brazos, it's aligned with slavery. But what Lipscomb's watching here in this case, and he's a smart man, he realizes what's happening is this connection between race and slavery isn't actually real. Race is constructed, it requires definition, and he sees a danger in this. So it's a fascinating case. What about the Germans? Again, I said they're divided on the slavery question. So there are some Germans who, had slaves. There are others who don't, and who you had to be very quiet about it, but who quietly kind of grouse about it and don't like slavery. But one thing to point out is that the Germans did have access to other forms of labor, which is Germans. This kind of continuing immigration into Texas meant that German farmers, for example, in Austin County, could kind of always depend on this continuing supply of more immigrants coming over. And, the Anglo farmers couldn't really do that, because the Germans they're going to try to work for Germans, right? So one other reason why the Germans don't really go into slavery as deeply is, well, they can't afford them. They're not as wealthy as the planters. But the other is that they have this pipeline, if you want to think of it, supply of German labor coming in. But that doesn't mean that they didn't accept the racial ideas of the time, and I think most of them did. It's being skeptical of slavery doesn't necessarily imply that you're going to be a racial egalitarian, and I think most of the Germans kind of fall into that zone. Maybe a little bit skeptical of slavery. It's distasteful. It doesn't look good. Maybe it's unchristian. But they're fairly convinced that black people are not their equals. So race kind of suffuses Brazos society in that way. This slave society on the Brazos, I guess you could say it was stable. It worked. Slavery was very profitable. It generated, resulted in lots of sugar and cotton. But there were kind of underlying tensions, and these tensions were really brought out increasingly during the 1850s and into the Civil War period leading up. And ultimately, of course, Texas seceded, as you all know, and became one of the Confederate states. And this was entirely connected with slavery. There's really not a whole lot of question about this. I don't mean to belabor the point, but I'll just quoting from the Texas Secession Declaration. It says, Texas was received as a commonwealth, holding, maintaining, and protecting the institution known as Negro slavery, the servitude of the African to the white race within her limits. So there's that connection with race. A relation that existed from the first settlement of her wilderness by the white race, and which her people intended should exist in all future time. So the secessionists were fairly clear in their own minds about what they were doing. But there were divisions in Texas on the question, not so much of slavery, but on the question of secession. And here I've just put up, the pictures of two very, very prominent Brazos residents who wound up on opposite sides of the secession debate. The first is Albert Sidney Johnston, who had a plantation in Brazoria County. I think a lot of you know he became a high-ranking Confederate general and was killed at Shiloh. And the second you'll all recognize, of course, is Sam Houston, another Brazos resident. He had a house at Independence on the Brazos. And of course, he, as governor of Texas during the secession crisis, refused to call a secession convention and so on and so forth. But all of these I should back up a second. When Texas seceded, if you actually look at the vote totals, you can come away with the impression that, wow, this was just overwhelmingly, I think it's in the 90-odd%, favored it. But that masks some pretty serious hidden divisions. And one of these was, this fear of German unionism. A lot of the Germans in Austin County especially were, even if they were divided on the question of of slavery, they were not as divided on the question of the Union. They wanted to stay in the Union. And the problem, of course, is that there was an awful lot of intimidation of Unionists. There was an awful lot of kind of extra-legal violence and intimidation. Go through some of the records on this. This was not a peaceful period in the history of the Brazos. There's a lot of nastiness going on there. The net result of which was to really intimidate and drive a lot of Unionists away from the polls. And so that has had a tendency to kind of distort the figures for secession. What I'm trying to suggest really is that there are a lot of kind of underlying hidden divisions in Brazos society. And the war didn't help that. During the war, a lot of the Germans on the Brazos evaded the draft, ran away to Mexico. And during the war, a lot of space was opened up for the enslaved people to resist. And what I kind of argue really is that during the war, Texas slavery was not healthy on the Brazos. It was actually kind of gradually crumbling and eroding. When you send, a large proportion of the men away into the army, it made it hard. It basically put it on women of the Brazos to try to keep order and run these plantations. And this was a very, very difficult thing to do. Enslaved men especially challenged women's authority. I mentioned the Lizzie Scott Neblett diary a moment ago. If you want to see this in action, read that wonderful diary. It's been published. And so there's a lot of kind of shakiness, underlying shakiness on the Brazos during the Civil War that a lot of times gets papered over. Finally, of course, slavery did come to an end. And famously, General Gordon Granger declared on June 19th, 1865, that all slaves are free. And what I really like about the statement is that he gives a little definition here. It says, this involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves. And the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired laborer. So what happened after, as slavery ends on the Brazos? I think one important point to remember is that didn't change the position of the Brazos in the kind of world system. It continued as a cotton-producing region, and it continued to use labor repressive methods. Not slavery, but there were a lot of other ways to do that. It was also characteristic of this sort of peripheral area. If you're not using slavery, it's indentured servitude or, debt bondage. There's all kinds of unfree labor systems that flourish out here on the periphery of the global system. But what I like about this quotation here is that Granger's kind of implicitly recognizing that simply declaring an end to slavery doesn't tell you anything about what's going to replace it. It doesn't tell you what it means to be free. You're free, but what does that really mean? And what developed here, on the Brazos, as elsewhere in the U.S. South, was kind of a three-way debate or fight over what it meant to be free. For landowners, they wanted the narrowest division possible. They wanted freedom to mean as little as possible. And really what they were looking for, okay, if you can't have slavery, then fine, but you still have to work. Texas, of course, like other states, passed the Black Codes that were designed to kind of immobilize Black laborers on the plantations after the end of slavery. For the federal government, freedom was a bit different. It meant the right to contract for labor. So the Republicans who controlled Congress during Reconstruction believed they're trying to create a free labor society, maybe a little bit like what existed in the northern United States. No physical violence, but they also drew up short on the question of land, and said, no, formerly enslaved people, sure, they may have cleared all the plantations and built all the houses, but they're not entitled to any part of that. They're going to have to just work as laborers. And so the federal government in a lot of ways is kind of interested in keeping black labor on the plantations. That's what's going to make them pay. The situation of the Brazos and the global economy hasn't changed. Freed people, of course, argued that meaningful freedom, for that to have any real validity, means you have to have land ownership. Otherwise, you're just forced to work for somebody else for wages. And of course, that is what happened. This, in a lot of ways, the rest of Brazos history through the 19th century and beyond was the kind of struggle between the first two options. Just how much are people going to be coerced or forced to work on plantations, and how much are they going to be free to sign contracts to work on plantations? Land ownership was, of course, taken off the table very, very early, by the federal government. It has to be said. So we're looking here at a picture of a sawmill in Industry, Texas, with a kind of a few black laborers there, who by this time, of course, would be wage laborers. But that's because they don't have farms. They're not able to kind of work for themselves. And that would be kind of the tragedy of all of this. So I think I've talked long enough. I'm going to say goodbye, but I do hope to have the chance to answer some of your questions and talk a little bit more. All right. Thank you very much.
I really hope you enjoyed our program with Dr. Sean Kelly of the University of Essex tonight. And as I mentioned, we recorded this program in advance to post for our month of May program, but there is a chance for you to send us any questions. If you were motivated by something tonight, I hope you'll consider sending me an email. So you'll see there on the slide is my email address. We're going to receive questions until roughly June the 12th before we start engaging Dr. Kelly again, let him get through his semester. And then we're looking at the best format to post some of those replies. So usually we would have a live Q&A at this point in the History at Night program. Because we can't do that, we wanted to give you this opportunity. And I do encourage you, if you have questions you want to share with us, please email them as you see there. Also wanted to let you know, as we typically do, our museum store is offering a book bundle in support of tonight's program. We do have copies of Dr. Kelly's book, Los Brazos de Dios, that we're bundling with one of our site guides for the visitor center here and for our permanent exhibits. That would be a $40 bundle for you. If you have any interest in that, you can also mention that in an email to me, and we'll get you coordinated for the copies of those books. And then, as a reminder, we're going to conclude season 2 of History at Night with one last virtual program, which will be on June the 24th. We're going to be joined by the public program director for the General Land Office, James Harkins. And he's going to help us navigate some of the great collection that the General Land Office has related to the stories of Austin's colony. It should be a really entertaining program. The GLO has been a great supporter and partner of ours over the last decade plus as we've prepared exhibits and program experiences here. And I think you'll really enjoy some of the content and the information that James is able to share with us. So again, as you see on the next slide, here's a review of our team. We usually project this every time we finish a program virtually, just so people will know who some of the players are. And we couldn't be more pleased that you chose to use some of your time to join us for History at Night. Until next time, thanks.